Hey there, welcome to the Energy Blueprint Podcast. I'm your host, Ari Whitten, and today I have with me for the second time, Dr. Sarah Myhill, who is a chronic fatigue syndrome and myalgic encephalomyelitis expert. She's been working in this field for many, many years. She's widely regarded as one of the top experts, top doctors in this field. She is the author of several books, including The Infection Gang, the Paleo Ketogenic Cookbook, and this one, which is the diagnosis and treatment of chronic fatigue syndrome and myalgic encephalomyelitis or encephalitis. And it's the subtitle, which I love, is it's mitochondria, not hypochondria. And she's also she's a co-author or a co-researcher in 3 different research papers relating to mitochondrial dysfunction and chronic fatigue, especially with regard to something called the ATP profile test, which is this test that they've used to specifically identify mitochondrial dysfunction in the context of chronic fatigue syndrome. So welcome for part 2, Dr. Sarah Myhill. Such a pleasure to have you on again.
Thank you, Ari, for inviting me back. You always ask the right questions, and that makes it very easy for me.
Thank you. Well, you know, I was just thinking about it right before we started recording, and I think you were actually literally one of my first or second interviews that I ever did. So hopefully I've gotten a little bit better as an interviewer over the last couple of years since I started doing this. But I want to start with kind of a recap with your big picture paradigm of chronic fatigue syndrome. And I'll just preface by saying that, you know, there's a lot of people who are sticklers for how this condition should be referred to: ME, CFS, myalgic encephalomyelitis or encephalitis, and chronic fatigue syndrome. I'm just going to call it CFS for short, just to make things a little easier, because myalgic encephalomyelitis is kind of a mouthful. So what is your big picture paradigm of chronic fatigue syndrome and how it develops, what causes it?
Okay. Chronic fatigue syndrome is a clinical picture that arises when energy demand gets close to energy delivery mechanisms. Now, let me explain that. We have a certain bucket of energy to spend in a day that has a limit on it. Now, if we spend more than that energy bucket, we die, because we don't have energy for the heart to work, for the brain to work, for muscles to work. So the body and the brain cannot permit that negative energy equation to occur. It cannot allow us to spend more energy than we've got. And therefore, to stop us spending that energy, it gives us very nasty symptoms. The obvious one is physical fatigue. What does physical fatigue do? It makes you want to lie down and rest up until the energy returns. It gives us foggy brain, depression, anxiety, stress. Why? Because those symptoms stop the brain spending energy. They want to, people who are depressed or stressed, they just want to go away and sit in a little hole until their energy comes back. It gives us muscle pain if we do too much, and that muscle pain is so severe it literally stops us moving. We know that pain is caused by lactic acid, and it's lactic acid, for example, that stops athletes winning gold medals. If the athlete had no lactic acid burn, he'd win everything, but he might die in the attempt. Mm-hmm. So we have symptoms for very good reasons. They protect us from ourselves. And what we mustn't do is mask symptoms, because that masks the underlying cause of. Now, I see chronic fatigue syndrome as the clinical picture that arises when energy delivery mechanisms start to fail and we don't have the energy to spend as we should. ME is chronic fatigue syndrome plus inflammation. And inflammation gives us any number of nasty symptoms: fever, gland swelling, arthritis, gut symptoms, brain symptoms, and feeling ill. And that inflammation, when the immune system is busy, occurs either because of chronic allergy, but increasingly because of chronic infection. And we now know that many of the ME patients, and of course, so ME is chronic fatigue plus inflammation, many of the ME patients are infection driven. Mm-hmm. And this is what triggered me to write the book, The Infection Gang, because so many MEs are infection driven. And they're not infections that are obviously recognizable to conventional medicine. They're stealth infections, things like Lyme disease, mycoplasma, chronic Epstein-Barr virus infection, which is mono in American lingo. And in fact, there's a wonderful American doctor called Dr. Martin Lerner, who demonstrated that Epstein-Barr virus is implicated in 80% of the post-viral chronic fatigue patients. And more importantly, when you treat that with antivirals, a very worthwhile proportion of those can recover. Mm-hmm. So if one has an idea of this roadmap, you have an idea of the energy delivery mechanisms, and then how the body is spending energy, and in particular, as I call it, the immunological hole in the energy bucket. The immune system is spending a lot of energy on fighting infection or fighting allergies. Then it's easy to see how the clinical pictures arise. One of the things that makes me so cross about doctors is that patients come and they come and consult and they say, oh yes, my doctor tells me that my ME is causing that. ME doesn't cause anything. ME is the symptom. We have to turn around and ask ourselves, what's causing the inflammation? What is causing the poor energy delivery mechanisms? Now, this is an analogy which I may not have talked about 2 years ago, but it's kind of crystallized since then. And with respect to energy delivery mechanisms, a car analogy is very helpful here, because I see there are 4 important players. To get your car to run, to get your body to go, you've got to have the right fuel in the tank. And the trouble with modern diets is they're all carbohydrate based, and those are not good foods for mitochondria. You then have to get the mitochondrial engine right, and this is where I've done these 3 papers that you mentioned earlier about mitochondrial dysfunction in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. Thirdly, we have to get the thyroid accelerator pedal set correctly, and fourthly, the adrenal gearbox. And if we can balance up those 4 aspects efficiently, then you have a good chance of optimizing your energy delivery mechanisms. And we know this is the case not just in the chronic fatigue syndrome field, but also in the athletic field. The keto-adapted middle distance and long distance runners function much better. They improve their performance times when they're running on fats rather than carbohydrates. As I'm sure you know, Mike Morton holds the world record for the furthest distance run in 24 hours. He ran 172 miles. Why? Because he's a keto-adapted athlete. He had all the fuel necessary on board to run 172 miles, and so he did. If he had been a carbohydrate-based athlete, he'd had to be constantly topping up with sugars and snacks and gels in order to fuel himself and keep going.
If I can comment on that just for a minute. So I do think it's likely, if it's a race, to see how long someone could go before they reach a point of exhaustion or bonking, as runners often call it. I think it's extremely likely that a keto adapted athlete would outperform a carbohydrate based athlete. But however, the flip side of this is that in any high intensity activity, it's been shown that keto diets generally impair performance.
Well, yes, because sugar is like a super fuel. It's like rocket fuel. And yes, that will give you a short-term mega hit of energy, but it's not sustainable long-term. So if I had an athlete who was doing a power event, then I would train them ketogenically and then carbohydrate load for them to do their super excellent performance. But the trouble is, what humans are doing at the moment is they're eating sugars and carbohydrates all the time. They're running on rocket fuel all the time, and that is not sustainable long-term. It's fine for a short-term burst, but not in the long term.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, there's a mismatch if you're taking somebody who's generally sedentary, who's not somebody who's extremely physically active and doing high intensity activities, and they're consuming lots of carbohydrates. I would definitely agree that's a mismatch.
Good. We agreed on that. But what this means is that the starting point to treat all my patients with chronic fatigue syndrome and all my patients with ME is diet. They've got to get the right fuel in the tank. Now, this is probably the most difficult thing that I ask my patients to do, but it is within the power of us all to do it. You don't have to go to an expensive clinic somewhere in the other side of the world to do this. Everybody controls what they put in there on their plate. Everybody controls what they eat. And the PK diet, as I say now, is non-negotiable. And that done well is absolutely the starting point. So people always ask me, oh, well, what do you eat? And I only eat twice a day. I never snack. And I do that because I know I'm an addict at heart. And if I start eating carbohydrates, I can't stop eating them. So I just eat fat and fiber and meat, and breakfast will be a good old-fashioned fry-up. I'm very lucky I have my own pigs, so I have my own bacon and sausage and eggs, maybe mushrooms. I make a PK bread, which is linseed-based, and that is my breakfast, and then that's it until the evening meal, which will be a starter of my PK bread, which is 2% carbohydrate, high in fiber, and then main meal will be meat and green vegetables, and then pudding will be maybe coconut milk, and I have a lovely coconut milk, which is only, again, 2% carb with berries. And that diet is absolutely the starting point. And if you're going to teach your patients effectively how to do this and understand the ins and outs of it and the difficulties, you have to do it yourself. You have to lead by example.
Sure.
And that's why I've written the diabetes book, the PK cookbook, and there's chapters on this in every book I've written because it's such an important part of therapy.
Yeah.
So having a go on.
Yeah. So just quick question. There are a lot of stories, I'm sure you've encountered some of them, of people, I think this is especially true of women, who try long-term ketogenic diets, and then after 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, something like that, they often report that their symptoms were made worse, and they crash and they experience all kinds of health problems that generally resolve when they reincorporate carbohydrates. And there's some also pretty well-known keto advocates that have been around for a long time who kind of warn of the dangers of long-term ketogenic diets and talk about incorporating carbohydrates at least cyclically in some capacity. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, or if you really recommend keto all the time forever.
Okay. If and as you rightly point out, this problem is more common in women. If they cannot keto adapt, it's almost always because they are hypothyroid. Now, normally the body uses thyroid hormones to fat burn. If it doesn't have the thyroid hormones for whatever reason, it'll switch to using adrenaline, and that's no good at all. You can't run the body on adrenaline. That's a short-term stress hormone. So those that fail to keto adapt within 2 or 3 weeks, I immediately think hypothyroidism, and do the test, do the blood tests, look at core temperatures, look at the clinical picture. But so often a supplement of thyroid glandular, such as natural desiccated thyroid or Armour thyroid or Metabev, makes the world of difference. Suddenly they can fat burn easily, and all those problems of keto adaptation just melt away. And hypothyroidism is very common.
Yeah. So I think we might be talking about two different things. One is this keto adaptation period at the beginning, where there's this kind of well-known keto flu, and this adaptation period of training your body to be more metabolically flexible and burn fats and ketones for fuel can be challenging and can make someone feel bad temporarily. But actually what I'm talking about is there's a lot of reports I've seen. Honestly, probably half of the people I've seen who go keto successfully for long periods of time. And honestly, I think a large portion can't adhere to the diet for anything longer than a few months. But
they're the ones that are hypothyroid.
Maybe. I think there's just, I think for the reason you mentioned about carbs, a lot of people like carbohydrate containing food. So it's also hard to just chronically deprive yourself of foods you like. But there's a large number of reports I've seen of people saying, I went keto, I felt amazing the first 3 months, I felt amazing, the first 5-6 months, and then I crashed hard, and then I started to experience health problems. So these seem to be people who are keto adapted, but after a period of time of several months of staying in that place, then they start to experience problems. Have you seen that at all?
Well, yes, I have seen it. And when you actually look at the nitty-gritty of their diet, I so often find that the diet has slipped, and they're allowing a bit of this or a bit of that. And they end up in what I call the metabolic hinterland, which is the worst of both worlds. Because in the metabolic hinterland, you can't get fuel from carbohydrates because you're not eating enough of it. And you can't fat burn because you're having a little bit of carb, you're spiking insulin, and that switches off fat burning. So whenever somebody comes to see me, if they say to me, yes, I am PK diet, I always say, I want to know exactly what you are eating. It's not good enough to say, yes, I'm PK. And there's always a slip up. They think sweet potato is okay. They think cashew nuts are acceptable, or they think that artificial sweeteners are okay, and artificial sweeteners are not okay. Why? The body is intelligent. If it tastes something sweet in the mouth, it will anticipate a sugar spike and pour out insulin in anticipation of that, and that switches you right out of keto burning, right out of fat burning. So I hear what you're saying, but I would want to know in each individual case what the issue was. Now, if I had somebody who was truly well doing the keto diet properly and experienced that, then almost certainly they are hypothyroid. Another possibility is they've run out of carnitine, because you need carnitine in order to get ketones into mitochondria. And the other thing that people often forget is when you're on a keto diet, your requirements for salt increase. And therefore you should be eating more salt. And just lack of salt will make people fatigued, as any Roman centurion will be able to tell you.
Interesting.
Or would have been able to tell you. So I am absolutely of the view that the PK diet is what our bodies evolved eating. It's what all other mammals consume. Horses, cattle, they just live on fiber. You give them starches and they end up with a fermenting gut. The horses get laminitis, the cattle get D-lactate acidosis. So all mammals, and indeed all birds, run on fats and ketones. And it's very few species that can run on a dual fuel. Pigs can do it. Pigs can run on almost any food, and so can humans. Now, the reason we evolved that ability is because in the autumn, we have a free bonanza of carbohydrates. We have fruit, we have honey, we have root vegetables. And if we eat those foods in an addictive way during the autumn, we get fat. And getting fat in the autumn is survival value for the winter. But primitive man gave up eating those carbohydrates because he had no choice. He ran out of them. He would gorge himself on bananas and fruit and get fat, and then the food supply would run out and he would be back to ketogenesis.
So now, just to be clear, I want to just clarify one thing, which is you're saying this is kind of how we evolved. This is the natural diet, is to be on a ketogenic diet. So are you saying that our ancestors, historically, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, existed on a ketogenic diet all the time, or they existed in the winter months on a ketogenic diet?
Well, certainly in the winter months, and certainly in the spring months, and probably many of the summer months, because the autumn harvest doesn't arrive until the autumn. Mm-hmm. And it evolved as a wonderful survival tool, because primitive man could get fat in the autumn and survive the winter.
So, well, let me just insert some data here. So there's lots of modern day hunter-gatherer tribes that actually have been studied. For example, the Hadza, the Tsimane, the Kuna, the Tuki Senta in Papua New Guinea, the Kitavans, who are not quite hunter-gatherers but are close in the South Pacific. So there's lots of tribes. Many of them are eating carbohydrate-based diets, and many of them exist in equatorial regions where they actually have access to carbohydrate-containing foods pretty much year-round. So they don't really have a harsh winter where there's no carbohydrates available. The Kitavans are eating 67% carbohydrate. The Hadza are eating, I think, close to 50%. Lots of honey that they get from bees. Lots of baobab fruits and things like that, berries and various other kinds of fruits and root vegetables. The Tuki Senta in Papua New Guinea are eating like 95% carbohydrate, pretty much all root vegetables. So I'm just wondering, the actual data on modern day hunter-gatherer tribes that have been studied generally does not show any indication of a ketogenic diet. The closest thing would be the traditional Inuit diet, which is obviously an extreme, very harsh polar climate where not a lot of plants grow. But I'm just wondering if you can kind of clarify that.
Well, in my view is if you look at where, I live here, in mid Wales, in the winter, there is nothing to eat except meat. There is nothing that grows. So whilst those rules may apply to people who live on the equator and have lived on the equator for hundreds of thousands of years and are well adapted to that, They don't apply to people who have migrated further away and they don't have those carbohydrates available throughout the year.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a large proportion of the population. And we have genetic roots which are very different from those guys who live on the equator.
Yeah.
And again, the point is that eating carbohydrates gets us to childbearing age. Now, nature, once you are beyond childbearing age, evolution and nature don't care. If I die tomorrow, it doesn't matter. I've passed my genetic flame on to the next generation. So if you rocket fuel yourself to childbearing age, which of course is quite young for humans, it's teenagers and 20s, then if you're on the evolutionary scrap heap thereafter, say nature doesn't care. If you want to live to a good age, then you have to kind of abide by these evolutionary principles, more thoroughly, and get off the carbohydrates. And you look at people there are more centenarians in Japan. Okay, now they're probably not than any other country. Now they're probably not perfect ketogenic diets, but traditional Japanese food is fairly low in carbohydrate, and so it makes good sense to me. And again, we know that so much modern pathology, cancer, heart disease, dementia, is carbohydrate driven. Dementia is called type 3 diabetes.
So I agree. If we're talking refined carbohydrates and refined sugars, I completely agree. If we're talking about modern processed foods and hyper processed foods in the Western diet, unquestionably linked with lots of disease, a huge disease burden. However, if we're talking about things like lentils or sweet potatoes or beans or something like that, I mean, these are decidedly linked with good health, both in randomized controlled trials, as well as the blue zones, the longest lived, healthiest populations in the world consume diets that are based on those foods. So I do think it's what you're saying is reasonable to say, if, based on one's ancestry, if they've migrated to very northern latitudes, for example, then it is very likely that they did have to deal with at least a winter and spring where they were predominantly fat based. But I don't necessarily agree with the claim that, all of our ancestors, our human ancestors were consuming a ketogenic diet.
Okay. But again, the tribes that you're talking about are essentially healthy people which have been eating those foods, and tolerating them fine. But what I see in my ME patients is they're carbohydrate addicts, and they end up with a fermenting gut, with the wrong microbiome, and the whole thing rolls on from there. Yeah. And therefore, to get those people to a state of health, we have to be paragons of virtue with their diet and give absolutely no excuse for wobbly blood sugars and no excuse for a fermenting gut, both of which are major problems for my ME chronic fatigue syndrome patients. So I hear what you're saying, but as we get sicker and as we age, I do think that we have to go more paleo and more ketogenic in order to stay well and function at a high level. I'll give you an example of the work of Dale Bredesen, who's a California neurologist who he took 10 patients with Alzheimer's disease, put them on a ketogenic diet, and reversed their Alzheimer's disease.
Right.
It was an outstanding result. So the point is, he's dealing with patients who are necessarily sick and has to go the whole hog. The diets he recommended did not include pulses and sweet potato.
Well, so I'll just play devil's advocate, and I'm not are you, by the way, are you drinking methylene blue in your water there?
Oh no, it's just the color of the glass. Sorry about that.
I thought that might be a nice, interesting aside on mitochondrial function and methylene blue, but so the counterpoint that I was going to bring up, and I like Dale Bredesen's work. I think it's great. However, I think you can also point to examples where, for example, a vegan high carb, low fat diet was, for example, in Dean Ornish's work, was responsible for reversing cardiovascular disease. There's a number of other studies that have shown a vegan high carb, low fat diet, very low fat diet can reverse diabetes and cause dramatic improvements.
You will have to send me those references.
Oh, I'm happy to, but they're easily accessible. For example, Michael Greger has videos on it. If you just Google nutritionfacts.org diabetes, you can see him with videos guiding you with the exact references, but I can post them on this page.
Mhm.
But keep in mind, I'm not a vegan, and I'm not a low fat diet advocate. I'm just trying to bring other data points to this discussion,
Mhm.
so that, because I don't think it's reasonable to paint a picture that a keto diet is the only path that can reverse disease, when we have good data to suggest that even high carb, low fat diets, if they are whole food based, would get rid of all the processed junk and the processed refined grains and added sugars. Even those diets can dramatically improve people's health and reverse disease.
I know, but you see, the trouble is, by saying you could do this and you could do that and you could do the other, adds another layer of complication for my patients.
It does.
And what I know is, it's a complicated disease, and we don't have all the tests to show you're doing this right, you're doing that right, or doing the other right. So we have to get some building foundation stones in there solid in order to add in the others.
Yeah.
And we know without a shadow of doubt that the preferred fuel of mitochondria are ketones, and that's why people should be eating fat and fiber. And having established that, we can then go on to look at the mitochondrial dysfunction. And obviously mitochondria, the engine of your car, they've got to have the right fuel in the tank. And then they may be going slow because they're deficient or they're blocked, and tests help us with that.
Yeah.
And then we go on to the control mechanisms, the thyroid and the accelerator pedal. And when those four issues are balanced up, you start to get the beginning of a picture. But if the diet is all over the place, and the trouble is, the carbohydrate addicts look for any excuse to put carbohydrates in there. And if they say, oh, I found a study where this diet worked and I can eat high carbs, then I say, no, that's not acceptable. It's back to square one. You've got to do the PK diet. And what I find is that the people who have the greatest problem with addiction have the best rationalizations for not doing the paleo ketogenic diet.
Yeah, I wouldn't debate you on that. I'm sure that's the case. So I want to come back to something you were explaining at the beginning, as far as your big picture paradigm of chronic fatigue, as far as energy demands exceeding energy supply. Now, do you see this as a spectrum of chronic fatigue of different degrees of severity, and kind of where does the cutoff exist for when it's chronic fatigue syndrome? So let me just add one layer here, which is, there's obviously more mild states of fatigue that wouldn't necessarily be characterized as chronic fatigue syndrome. Somebody's just sleep deprived and stressed at work, and they just haven't slept in a couple of weeks, enough, and they've got too much stress in their life and they're going through a hard time, and they're going to be much more tired than normal. So how do you conceptualize this kind of continuum of fatigue, and what is the criteria for when you think it's chronic fatigue syndrome?
Well, anybody who is not functioning at 100% of their potential arguably has a chronic fatigue syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
It is just a descriptor. And chronic fatigue occurs when they say the gap between energy delivery mechanisms and energy expenditure starts to narrow. And one guy came to see me, and his definition of chronic fatigue syndrome was that he could only do his marathons in 2 hours 40. And he had exactly the same workup as my other patients, and he got it down to 2 hours 20, and he was a very happy guy. He went away and won the Potter's Marathon. So I don't find these definitions terribly useful. They are just symptoms. And if people and doctors accepted that, then we would be much more effective at preventing chronic fatigue syndromes and ME, which sometimes results when you haven't got the energy to deal with the infection, than if we say, oh no, we're not going to diagnose you until you're that sick. We're not going to diagnose you until you can't get out of bed. So I don't have a kind of a diagnostic category of chronic fatigue syndrome and ME. Anybody who is not living to their full potential has a chronic fatigue syndrome, and we need to ask the question why. And all the things that I apply to my patients, I apply to myself. Why? Because I want to live to my full potential. Energy is my most precious possession. I love spending it. I love spending it mentally, physically, emotionally, trotting around the garden, and so on. And so I'm prepared to put in a lot of effort to make sure I've got lots of energy. So I'm disciplined with my diet, I'm disciplined with my sleep, I take basic active supplements, I don't burn the candle at both ends, dee-da, dee-da, dee-da.
Yeah.
And we should all be doing this.
Yeah, I'm with you. So it sounds like it basically, you see it as almost a perfect continuum without a lot of distinctions. Um, it sounds like you don't really see chronic fatigue syndrome per se as a distinct thing. It's basically just like arguably a more severe version of the same thing that is characterized by more mild states of fatigue.
Absolutely. I know, and so we'd be much better doctors if we all thought of things like that. In fact, I now see the whole of life from the energy perspective. And of course, when we're young, we have very efficient energy delivery mechanisms, which means kids can often get away with eating complete rubbish. They don't have their mitochondria buzzing because they're young and work well. They haven't had any chance or time to acquire thyroid and adrenal disorders. So the young have got lots of energy to spend. And guess what? As parents, we run around making sure they've got lots of lovely food and they don't have to work and all they have to do is trot off to school. So young people are bursting with energy. And then as we age and our energy delivery mechanisms become less efficient, maybe we don't eat as well as perhaps we should, and then we become deficient in things because we don't absorb micronutrients as efficiently as we should, and then we get infected because that's the nature of life. We're going to go through life picking up infections. The whole thing starts to crumble down. So by the time you get to 80 or 90, you're expected to be fatigued. You're expected to potter around and crawl from one situation to the next. That's normal. It's aging. Yeah, but what is aging? That's what we have to ask ourselves. You can't put things down to, oh, it's your age. There has to be a mechanism for that. And if you always think causation, you always try to distill things down to their component parts, then you have a good chance of fixing them. Mm-hmm. And so the diet is the starting point. Again, the reason why the mitochondrial engines, I call it, the reason why they are so important is because they determine energy delivery at the cellular level. And if mitochondria go slow in the heart, you get heart failure. If mitochondria go slow in the brain, you get brain failure. If mitochondria go slow in the kidneys or the liver, you get kidney and liver failure. So they are such an important engine. And mitochondria are a common engine to all mammals and all plants. So my little dog Nance has the same mitochondria as I do. So do those cows out there. So do those sheep out there. It's a fundamental biological unit. Mm-hmm. Now, I got interested in this in the 1990s, that mitochondria might be implicated in chronic fatigue, in energy delivery mechanisms. And that's when I teamed up with Dr. John McLaren Howard, who developed mitochondrial function tests. Now, those tests are technically very difficult to do. And there's a lab currently trying to redo those, reproduce them in Germany. But even without mitochondrial function tests, we can still help patients, because I've now done, I think the last count was 984 of them. And essentially mitochondria go slow because they're lacking the raw material to function. Now, I started getting interested in this after reading Dr. Stephen Sinatra's book, The Sinatra Solution. He is a cardiologist and demonstrated that, of course, mitochondria are central in all cardiac disease, particularly cardiac failure. But by giving what he described as his awesome foursome supplements, D-ribose, magnesium, CoQ10, and niacinamide, to which I would add in acetyl L-carnitine, he saw reversal of cardiac pathology. Why? Because he was correcting the mitochondria. Funnily enough, I've just been dealing with a patient recently who had very severe heart failure and had the most appalling prognosis. Anyway, we started him on the awesome foursome of those supplements, and clinically he was markedly improved, so much so he was able to go and play badminton again, something he would never consider doing. Mm-hmm. And he went back to the Brompton for a follow-up where he had his usual echocardiogram, and they told him his ejection fraction was 5% of what it should be. Wow. Now, they looked at him and said, you should be dead. Nobody functions with an ejection fraction of 5%. Mm-hmm. Now, I can't quite square that with the mitochondrial stuff, but we were doing something very right. He was off his drugs for heart failure, he was just taking nutritional supplements, and he was playing badminton. So he was substantially improved. So mitochondria may be going slow because of those deficiencies, or they may be going slow because they are blocked by something. And the obvious thing that would block it would be organophosphate pesticides. Now, the business of making energy is called oxidative phosphorylation. And guess what? It's blocked by organophosphates. Now, what is the most widely used pesticide in the world? Glyphosate. Glyphosate is an organophosphate. And it may well be that, you know, that is a major problem for mitochondrial dysfunction in the West. And guess what? When we do toxicity studies, you know, it's not uncommon for organophosphates and glyphosates to appear as a cause of blocking.
Mm-hmm.
But another major cause of blocking are products of the fermenting gut. And this brings us back to diet again. Because if you have an upper fermenting gut, you are producing products like alcohol, delactate, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia compounds, and all these have the potential to inhibit mitochondria.
Yeah. Speaking of delactate, there's been some studies recently that have come out on actually probiotic supplementation, showing that certain kinds of probiotic supplementation may actually cause delactic acidosis. Like you as a result of consuming these potentially healthy supplements, or sometimes healthy depending on the strain, some strains seem to make your gut produce tons of delactate, which actually can make you unhealthier. Do you have any thoughts on that, or have you seen that research?
Well, I'm very aware of that, yes. And I'm also very aware that many of my patients just don't seem to tolerate probiotics. Some people get great benefit from them. But the bottom line is that probiotics that you buy in a capsule or in a ferment are all oxygen tolerant. They will survive in oxygen perfectly well. But actually 90% of most of the probiotics in the gut are anaerobes. They don't tolerate oxygen at all. And what that means is that we can only get 10% of the gut microbiome in a capsule. 90% of it we cannot swallow. And you're probably aware of fecal bacteria therapy, which of course is the only way you can properly recolonize the gut with anaerobic microbes.
What just out of curiosity, what about something like kimchi or sauerkraut?
I agree there are some anaerobic bacteria in there, but if your gut is functioning properly, they shouldn't survive the upper gut. The upper gut should be a sterile, acidic, digesting gut that kills all bacteria that are consumed. Now, even dead bacteria will do some good in the gut further down because the enzymes that they contain and because their immune programming. But I don't think you can expect to recolonize the gut using probiotics, whether it's kimchi or sauerkraut or whatever, simply because if your gut is working as it should, then the upper gut should sterilize that.
Mm-hmm.
I say, not they don't do good en passant, but they won't. You can't expect those microbes to recolonize the gut. You'd have to have a special gut preparation for that to happen, is my guess. The only really effective way to inoculate the gut would be to use the Thomas Borody techniques that he's developed in Melbourne, whereby you sterilize the gut and then introduce fecal samples from a fresh donation from a guy who has got, or from a woman who has got a healthy gut microbiome.
Do you do that in your practice?
I beg your pardon?
Do you do that in your practice?
No, I don't, because what I find is if I put all the other things in place, that very rarely becomes necessary. And all the other things are the ketogenic diet, the paleo-ketogenic diet, lots of fiber. Another very useful tool that I find myself using all the time is vitamin C. Now, the joy of vitamin C is cheap, it multitasks, anybody can get it. And the point about vitamin C is you can choose a dose of vitamin C that is sufficient to kill the few, maybe 100,000 microbes in the upper gut, but not the trillions in the lower gut. And that's called taking vitamin C to bowel tolerance. And it's a tool I very regularly use to treat the fermenting gut, because you can up the dose and up the dose and up the dose until you start to get loose stools or foul-smelling winds, and then you ride at bowel tolerance and you just drop it back a little. So most people need 8 to 10 grams a day to get to bowel tolerance. But those who've got a major problem with upper fermenting gut, or those who are very toxic, or those who've got a large infectious load, may need 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 grams to get to bowel tolerance. Mm-hmm. And the joy of vitamin C is, as I say, it multitasks. It doesn't just sort out fermenting gut. It's the starting point to treat any infection, whether it's chronic or acute. It's a very good antioxidant. it helps us to detox, and so on. So it's a great tool. And that combination of the paleo-ketogenic diet combined with vitamin C to bowel tolerance is one I use a lot.
Is that, what's the protocol for that? So is it something that you recommend vitamin C indefinitely, or just for an initial phase of, let's say, a week or two in this very high doses, and then you scale it way back?
No, it should be used, well, it depends on how sick the patient is, but it should be used indefinitely. I think it's humans, fruit bats, and guinea pigs are the only mammals that can't make their own vitamin C. So, dogs, goats, horses, cows, when they get sick, they can greatly ramp up the body's own production of vitamin C to deal with any infectious challenge, and then it drops back down again. Humans can't do that. It's a 4-enzyme step. We've lost one of those enzyme steps. So we have to use our brains to achieve the same thing. And thankfully, we're intelligent. Thankfully, we can easily manufacture ascorbic acid, and we have to use our brains to take it to best advantage. You're probably aware, I always quote Linus Pauling, only guy to receive 2 Nobel Prizes in his own right for science. He devoted the last third of his life just to the research of ascorbic acid and vitamin C, and maintained, it's one of the most important tools we can use for longevity and good health. And I think he was absolutely spot on.
Yeah. I want to circle back to mitochondria for a minute. You were talking about some of the ways that mitochondrial function can be inhibited. At the end of our podcast a couple of years ago, I mentioned Robert Naviaux's work to you on the cell danger response. I'm curious, did you actually look into that at all?
Oh gosh, yes.
Yeah.
And it is, he goes into enormous depth, and I think his work is fantastic. But we have to step back and ask ourselves, what happens in the cell danger response? And basically, it's another mechanism by which the body stops itself spending too much energy. So initially, when a cell is challenged, it pours out energy to fight that challenge, whatever it may be, whether it's an infectious challenge or a toxic challenge or whatever. But it knows it can't spend energy endlessly because it will just die. And therefore, it has to greatly ramp down energy generation and cell mechanics and cell metabolism in order to survive. It's effectively, the cell goes into almost a hibernation phase. And of course, that's going to manifest clinically with a chronic fatigue or an ME.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yes, he's done some fantastic work there.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. I'm glad that you had some time to look into that. I feel like it connects so well with everything you were already doing. I was amazed that you hadn't encountered it before, but I feel like it was going to be such a fun thing for you to read his work and connect the dots with what you were already doing. I'm related to mitochondria, a couple other things that I want to mention here. One is, are you familiar with Garth Nicholson's research on lipid replacement therapy at all? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And yeah, in fact, at a conference about 97, I think I sat next to him and his wife, Nancy, and we had a long chat.
Nice. Nice. There's some remarkably impressive research on people with fatigue, and just a matter of, some of the studies are 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, showing huge reductions in fatigue just from using phospholipid formulations to replace some of these damaged phospholipids in the mitochondria.
Correct. It's one of those wonderful tools, which I call it multitasks. It helps to detox, it's going to be antimicrobial, it's rebuild membranes, organize cell chemistry more efficiently, and so on and so forth. So yes, it's a fantastic tool. My problem is I don't have facilities for doing intravenous therapy here. It is expensive. It would be unaffordable for many of my patients, but yes, it's a very useful tool that we can always move on to. Thankfully, I have a colleague, Dr. Puria, who does do this, and yes, I would refer patients on to her if I got stuck or we felt that was appropriate.
So actually, a lot of the studies are just using an oral formulation, oral phospholipid formulation.
Yes, well, I do that almost as a routine part of my treatment. The basic package of supplements that people get would include high dose phospholipids and lecithin and essential fatty acid. So that's part of the standard workup.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
I wouldn't do that in isolation. This condition is one of those things where the more tools you can use to tackle the problems that are going on, the better the chance of success.
Yeah.
And because it's hard work and it's expensive, we have to start off with the cheap and cheerfuls like diet and basic supplements and vitamin C and a few mitochondrial supplements, and then build it from there.
Yeah.
And I have to say, the most frustrating aspect of my work is when I know exactly what's got to be done to get that patient well, but they don't have the resources to be able to put those things in place.
Right. Yeah. I'm curious also if you've looked into melatonin and mitochondrial function. There's some really fascinating research on how melatonin may be the single most potent protector of our mitochondria. And obviously this connects with the fact that in the modern world, we're all being exposed to so much artificial light in the evenings that is suppressing our brain's natural production of melatonin, this thing that most people just think of as a sleep hormone, but people don't realize it's also, like I said, this probably the most powerful protector of our mitochondria. I'm just curious if you've read any of that research and if you have any thoughts on kind of sleep and melatonin in all of this picture of chronic fatigue.
Of course, I mean, the point here is that, mitochondria are generating energy. You cannot produce energy without producing free radicals, and free radicals are extremely damaging. Now, every living cell, in the world has to have, from right down to bacteria, have to have a period of quiescence when they shut down and the healing and repair mechanisms can move in. And that's what melatonin triggers. And that's why sleep is so important. And we can easily test melatonin. It's a simple saliva test. And yes, you want the optimum amounts of melatonin. So again, as part of my standard workup, I would talk at length about sleep. When are you going to sleep? What's your quality of sleep? When do you wake up? And if it's less than perfect, yes, let's measure melatonin levels. So absolutely essential part of healing and repair.
Excellent. In your book, you spend a lot of time talking about immunological holes in the energy bucket. I think it's maybe the bulk of your book is, or a big chunk of it at least, is talking about that. And then you have a section on reprogramming the immune system. Do you have any, can you talk a bit about what reprogramming the immune system entails?
One of the problems of switching the immune system on is there's no guarantee that it's going to switch itself off. So as many patients have their ME triggered by a flu-like illness, and as if the flu has never gone away, the immune system's never dealt with it properly, it remains in an activated form. Now, the trouble with modern Western lives is they're very pro-inflammatory. There are lots of things that we do that switch on inflammation. The obvious one is high carbohydrate does. Sugar tends to switch on inflammation. Allergies allergies to foods tend to, like gluten and dairy, which are very common, tend to switch on inflammation. We vaccinate so much, and guess what vaccination does? It tends to switch on inflammation in the body, and we now know that many autoimmune conditions are switched on by vaccination. Using metals in surgery for hip replacements or knee replacements, many of those metals are immunogenic. They switch on inflammation. And once we switch the inflammation on, it's very difficult to switch it off. And so sometimes we need extra tools to do that. Now, some of those, there are natural anti-inflammatories that we can use, like melatonin, for example, like vitamin D. High dose vitamin D is a good anti-inflammatory. Vitamin C, again, helps to damp down inflammation. But sometimes we need to use immunotherapy, if you like, to reprogram the immune system. Now, the one that I've been using for decades, since the early 1980s, is enzyme potentiated desensitization. I think in America it's called a low-dose antigen, LDA. But that is a proven benefit in switching off allergies and maybe help in some autoimmune conditions. In this country, neutralization is used in a few centers. On the continent, there's a technique called microimmunotherapy, which is preferred. So there are various techniques for switching off a badly or an incorrectly programmed immune system. What you have to be mindful of is that the immune system may be switched on for very good reasons, i.e. because there's a chronic infection there. And that chronic infection, it might be tuberculosis or hepatitis, and that's something that the conventional doctors are very aware of. And guess what? All those conditions will present with the chronic fatigue syndrome. But increasingly, we are seeing infections that the conventional medical profession do not recognize, the most obvious, of course, being Lyme disease, infection with Borrelia. But Epstein-Barr virus, again, I mentioned the Dr. Martin Lerner work earlier. Mycoplasma, that's what Garth Nicholson was doing. He recognized that many cases of Garth-War syndrome were caused by a chronic low-grade infection with Mycoplasma incognito. And the one I've become interested in most recently is the idea that many ME patients have a chronic fungal infection. Now, you may be aware of the work of Dr. Joseph Brewer, who demonstrated that 90% of ME patients carry a load of mycotoxins. He established that by developing a urine test to measure mycotoxins in the urine. Now you're going to say to me, what are mycotoxins? If you look at life from the point of view of a bacteria or from a fungi, having made itself, comfortably at home in an environment, it doesn't want anybody else moving in. It wants that environment for itself. And therefore it produces toxins to prevent that happening. So in the bacterial world, we have clostridial toxins, we have tetanus toxins, we have staphylococcal toxins. In the fungal world, we have mycotoxins. So for example, the examples we all know about would be penicillium, which produces penicillin. Fungi produce cephalosporins. Fungi produce streptomycins. So many antibiotics are actually fungal mycotoxins. But there are mycotoxins which are very toxic to us, like aflatoxin, like ochratoxin, like mycophenolic acid. And these we can measure in the urine. And this is what Dr. Brewer did. Simple urine test. Having demonstrated the presence of mycotoxins in the urine, he then asked the question, well, where are these coming from? And what's so fascinating is that he showed that the most of them exist in the upper airways and the sinuses. And he used topical antifungals, systemic antifungals to reduce the fungal load in the airways. And this was in those patients that tolerated the treatment, and about 34% didn't. 80%, over 80% of them saw worthwhile clinical benefit from that. And that was paralleled by falling levels of mycotoxin in the urine. So that's a very useful clinical study. And in my ME patients, that has been a very useful clinical tool. So anybody who presents with a history of sinusitis, rhinitis, postnasal drip, polyps, catarrhal conditions, always think mycotoxins. They may well have a chronic fungal infection of the upper airways, and that is kicking an immunological hole in their bucket by activating the immune system and actively poisoning them, because these, being no doubt, are poisons. They're nephrotoxic, they're immunotoxic, they're hepatotoxic, etc.
Yeah.
So that has been a very useful addition to my armamentarium since we last spoke.
Yes. Yeah. Very interesting. So I want to point something out here that I think is important, which is you've talked about a lot of different potential contributors to chronic fatigue. I think a lot of people have a tendency, I think this is a very human tendency, to kind of latch on to one specific thing and say, it's the mycotoxin. That's what it is. So now I need to, my next, attempt to cure myself will be to use antifungals in my upper respiratory tract, or it's the gut. And so I need to just fix my gut. And that's the thing. Or it's the Epstein-Barr virus, and I need to just kill off the Epstein-Barr virus. I think if you really pay attention to what you're saying here, and please correct me if you disagree with my interpretation, is that there is widespread dysfunction in multiple systems of the body. So yeah, latching on to just one of these layers and trying to just attack that one layer is almost guaranteed to result in failure. Is that
correct?
Okay.
Getting people well from chronic fatigue syndrome is like building a house. You've got to get all the foundation stones in place first, with the diet and the sleep and the pacing and the micronutrients, and then you build on that with the mitochondrial stuff and the thyroid stuff and the adrenal stuff, and then you look for the immunological holes. You have to see the whole picture. And the important bit about this isn't just a treatment for chronic fatigue syndrome. This is a treatment for the whole of human disease. You put all this stuff in place, and you will live a long life to your full potential, and you won't get cancer, and you won't get heart disease, and you won't get dementia. See it as investment in the future. Yeah. And yes, it's hard work now, but one of my favorite Chinese saying is, if you don't change direction, you may end up where you're heading. And that's what I say to my own patient, I can see, you're heading for the rocks, there's disaster ahead. Change direction now before you get that nasty diagnosis. Don't give me a ring in a year's time and say you've had a heart attack or you've been diagnosed with dementia. Do something about it now, because I can see where you're heading.
Yeah, I think that's a nice segue to what I also wanted to add to this, which is, given that there's this widespread dysfunction, the way I see this happening is, let's say it might start, and there's probably 20 different scenarios that could occur, but let's say it just starts with somebody being overly stressed, and then being sleep deprived from the stress, and then going through a period of maybe mild or moderate fatigue. But if that continues, and then maybe they, have some traumatic thing that happens in their life, and then they get Epstein-Barr virus, and now they have post-viral fatigue that's much more severe. Now things start to, as this goes on, if they don't take really serious action to correct their health and bring themselves back into balance, if this goes on for many years, things can spiral out of control, and now multiple systems of the body start to dysfunction. You get chronic inflammation, you lose your immune health, such that you now get infections with mold and with chronic viral infections, and all these other things are getting out of control. I think, when we talk about something like a chronic Epstein-Barr virus infection or the chronic mold infection, from my perspective, it's just important to understand that those things are usually very downstream. Those things are usually like much later on, after lots of initial causes have already generated very severe dysfunction in the body. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that wholeheartedly.
Okay.
And that's why it's so important. When somebody comes and sees me, I want their history from birth. What happened as a child? Did they get sick then? What were they like as teenagers? Did they have, Epstein-Barr virus? Did they get irritable bowel syndrome? So that they can see the progression. And as you put all these interventions in place, then that whole thing goes into reverse. But you're so right. It's like talking about, say we didn't have a diagnostic pathway for pain, and we just say, oh, you've got chronic pain syndrome. Would anybody say, oh, well, have I got a pin in my foot? Is my foot there at all? Has it been amputated? Is there a chronic infection? We are much more analytical about pain than we are fatigue, but they're just subjective symptoms, aren't they?
Yeah.
So you are so right. We have been brainwashed almost by doctors into believing one symptom, one cause, one drug to treat it, and it's just not like that.
Yes.
It's the whole thing. If your car's going to go, it's got to be regularly serviced. It's got to have the right fuel. You've got to get the engine timing right. And the body is infinitely more complicated than a car. But the general basic principles are the same. We have to do as much as we can for as long as we possibly can, with every inch of our strength, or every ounce of our strength rather, in order to function to our full potential. And believe you me, it's always going to be a battle. We know it's a battle that we're going to lose. If I lose that battle when I'm 100, I'll settle for that. I had a bloody good life. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself, and I've got the most out of it. And that's what I want for my family, my friends, and all my patients too. And what I'm saying is, it's within the power to. And what do the doctors do? They symptom suppress. And this, I have to say, drives me insane, because we have symptoms for good reasons. They they protect us from ourselves. And what does the man on the street do? He symptom suppresses with addictions. He symptom suppresses fatigue with caffeine. He symptom suppresses stress with alcohol and nicotine. He symptom suppresses fatigue with, maybe he goes out and get cocaine and ecstasy or whatever. But that's just driving us into a greater hole.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the other things I want to mention here, I think what your commentary on the conventional medical approach is very pertinent, but also I think within more holistic medicine and functional medicine communities, there's also one distinction that I think is important. And this is not true of all practitioners, certainly, but I think is true of a lot of them. There is such a hyper focus now on the personalization aspect, that everybody is a unique individual, and that we need to find out this specific person's unique triggers. And so we do this battery of tests and we identify their unique things. And it's this genetic variation of the MTHFR gene and COMT gene, and it's this gut test showed this, and this organic acid test showed this, and so we do these very targeted interventions. And I think a lot of those practitioners are skipping over the foundational steps that you're talking about here, which are these universal basics of, as you said just now, we got it before we even get there. We got to get the diet in place. We got to get the sleep in place. We got to get stress management in place. All these other foundational pieces must be in place. And these are the universal basics that apply to everyone. I personally believe are the most important thing and are the biggest factor in recovery, not the hyper-personalized, very targeted therapies, but the universal basics, I think, can cure a huge percentage of people. But
I so agree with you. I so agree with you. And as I get older, my medicine gets more simple, because what I know is that the basic things done really well get you an awful long way there. Mm-hmm. I mean, for example, I never do gene studies. Why? Because they're not sufficiently prescriptive. They don't tell you exactly what's going to be done. They just tell you, well, you might have a problem here and you might have a problem there. And 90% of disease is environmental. Only 10% is genetic. Yeah. So get the environment as best as you possibly can. And the important thing about this is it's within the powers of everybody to do this. You don't have to have an expensive functional medicine doctor who does fancy tests. You just get your act together and do the diet and do the vitamin C and take the basic pasture supplements. And all the details are in my book. Anybody can access those. If you can't afford the book, it's all on my website. The information is there, the dose of this, the dose of that, the detox regime is all there free. It's just some people prefer the book version, which is why I did the books. Yeah. But, these tools are at everybody's disposal. Okay, there will be the rare occasion when you diagnose Lyme disease, and yes, you'll need the package of antibiotics, or you'll have done absolutely everything and you're still down with Epstein-Barr virus and you'll need the antivirals or whatever. But they are right at the end of the road, and I would never start people on antimicrobials until I got the full package in place first. Why? Because for many, that's all they need to do. Yeah. I mean, if I tested people off the street, 90% of them are going to test positive for Epstein-Barr virus. We've all been affected by it. But those people get chronic fatigue syndrome, they're the ones who are right on the edge. They're living life on the edge of the energy equation, and they haven't got the energy to deal with that, and then they fall into a hole. And so their body's reserve capacities is so low that their body is not able to keep the Epstein-Barr virus at bay. Correct. It switched into Robert Naviaux's cell danger response. They haven't got the energy to deal with it, and they just go into hibernation until they hope things will pick up and normal function can be restored. Yeah. I want to be sensitive to your time, but I have a couple more quick questions. Okay. One, I want to contrast this paradigm that you're painting here, which I very much agree with, by the way. It's big picture paradigm, the focus on these universal basics, addressing multiple factors, the fact that it's not just one cause, one treatment's going to fix it, but it's this big picture paradigm of how do we bolster the health of the entire system of our body through many different strategies, from nutrition to many other lifestyle factors, strategies, as well as maybe targeted therapies for specific things. But there are, also other approaches out there that are, for example, the Ashok Gupta's method or the lightning process, and kind of these very stress focused approaches that kind of conceptualize chronic fatigue as almost entirely caused by psychological and emotional stressors. And so the solution therefore is to lower your stress load, to stop negative thinking, to meditate and do other kind of cognitive behavioral processes to reduce psychological stress. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that approach. There are certainly people who've been improved by that. The point here being is that the two biggest holes in our energy bucket are the immunological hole we've talked about and the emotional hole. You can use up a huge amount of energy with the brain going round and round and round, thinking about things and almost being out of control of their thoughts. And we know that hypervigilance in childhood, sexual abuse in childhood, physical abuse in childhood, bullying are all major risk factors for chronic fatigue, because as that just kicks a hole in the energy bucket. it stops people sleeping well, and so on and so forth. I mean, as we speak, I am doing a lot of work with soldiers, with veterans of wars with post-traumatic stress syndrome. And they have discovered that there are ceremonies that they can attend in South America using ayahuasca or various traditional herbs, where they can kind of relive those experiences and hopefully dismiss them, and have been substantially improved for that. I don't pretend to be an expert in that, but these are incredibly fit, tough guys who are just wiped out by post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, there's
And
some
deal
really
with that,
breakthrough
and they can
research
be
happening now with MDMA and post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's actually going through, I think, phase 2 clinical trials here in the United States now.
Voila! But that illustrates the emotional hole we can have in our energy bucket.
Mm-hmm.
And that fits very nicely into the roadmap as I looked at it. Now, I don't pretend to be as skilled in psychotherapy or good technique, but at least I can say that's the problem, matey, and you go and find a good counsellor and you improve the quality of your sleep. Again, we seem to be seeing epidemics of post-traumatic stress at the moment, and I think, again, dare I say, this has to do with carbohydrate diets. Because if you are eating a carbohydrate diet, then you're spiking adrenaline throughout the night. Now, as you know, there are 2 phases of sleep. There's REM sleep, where we dream and problem solve for the future. And there's non-REM sleep, where we're not dreaming, but we deal with the problems of the past. And what I think happens is that if we are in non-REM sleep with spiking adrenaline, we're reliving the memories of the day in an adrenalized environment, and thereby perpetuating the bad ones. And interestingly, there's been some good work done by giving people with post-traumatic stress a beta blocker at night, stops them, so it blocks the effect of that spiking adrenaline, and allows them to get over their post-traumatic stress much more quickly. It's been a good treatment for. So again, the first thing I would do with post-traumatic stress is back to the ketogenic diet. So you can relive those memories in a non-adrenaline fueled environment and deal with them more rationally than otherwise.
Interesting. One more comment on another person's method that I was hoping to get. Again, your colleague there in the UK, who's Raymond Perrin, who's a very nice guy, and I've had on the podcast before, and he's got a very interesting theory of chronic fatigue syndrome, and he seems very hyper-focused on the lymph system. And has developed a specific lymph drainage protocol that I have seen some people report success with, but definitely doesn't seem to be a cure for everyone by itself. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on his theory and how that connects with what you're doing.
Well, again, I see that as another detox technique. Mm-hmm. And if through the lymphatics you can mobilize them and help the body to detox, then that's going to benefit in many ways. It's going to, if you detox, then mitochondria are going to function better. Hormone receptor resistance state is going to be improved. Having a poison in the body is like throwing a handful of sand into a finely tuned engine. It messes up in all sorts of unpredictable ways. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think Raymond Perrin's a good guy. He's asking all the right questions, and there's no doubt his techniques have been helpful for patients. But it needs to be part of the greater package. I wouldn't do that as a one-off, off you go, boy, let's see if that one works. Because in isolation, it's not going to be work. It's going to be part of the whole building.
Yeah. On a final note, I am wondering if you could leave people with maybe your top 1 or 2 kind of big takeaways or pieces of advice. If somebody's been dealing with chronic fatigue or chronic fatigue syndrome for a long time now, what are the top 1 or 2 things that you want to leave them with after listening to this interview?
Well, the most important thing they can do is realize there is much they can do for themselves. You do not need an expensive doctor or therapist to get the ball rolling and to make things happen. And the first thing they've got to do is the wretched PK diet. Take a basic package of supplements, really think about sleep and be disciplined about that, and don't exercise. If you exercise, you will just slow your recovery. And get that basic package in place and established, and then move on to the other things. And I say the strategies I outline in detail in my books, and they're there on my website if you can't afford the books. But we all have it within us to improve matters substantially. I don't say cure, because I would never promise that, but certainly to move in the right direction. And as I say to my ME patients and my chronic fatigue syndrome patients, you may be feeling jolly awful now, but when we get you right, you will have added years. You will get to 80 and 90 and 100 years of age, because you will have put in place all those interventions you need to do to not die young from heart disease or cancer or dementia. Mm-hmm. So there is no excuse for anybody not to put these regimes in place for immediate benefit and for long-term benefit, but it's difficult.
Yeah, beautiful. I want to recommend everybody listening to get this book off Amazon, Diagnosis and Treatment of Chronic Fatigue Syndrome and Myalgic Encephalitis. It's mitochondria, not hypochondria. It's a great book. It was one of the books that was very influential on me many years ago when I read it for the first time. And I highly, highly recommend it. I think it's an amazing resource for people dealing with chronic fatigue. Dr. Myhill, if people want to reach out to you directly, if they are interested in working with you, do you have a place where they can reach out with? Can people work with you?
Well, my problem is time. And actually now I've got to the stage where I know I've written the important books that need to be written. And I'm going to start a series of what I call road shows. So I'm going to get myself a little mobile camper van, and I'm going to go into people's houses where maybe 15 or a dozen people will gather, and we will sit around and I will explain how they can sort themselves out. I won't be treating individual patients. I'll be saying, this is the roadmap, these are the strategies, this is what you've got to do, here are the books you've got to read, this is where you go. And I hope then to spread the word more efficiently, and by doing that, more people learn. I've also set up a website just called Natural Health Worldwide, where any doctor, qualified health professional or experienced patient can log in and be available to help others. So it's a networking system, based on these regimes in order to spread the word, and most importantly, to get the message across to people, you can do it yourself. I try to empower people, give them the information and the confidence to give it a go.
Beautiful. Again, everybody go grab this book on Amazon. Dr. Myhill, thank you so much for your time. It was really a pleasure to connect with you for podcast number 2. I really, really enjoyed this. Thank you.
My pleasure, Ari. Thank you for your time.
Hey there, this is Ari again. One more quick thing before you go. Just make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Energy Blueprint, and also make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or anything else. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview, and I will see you again next week.